Welcome to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we examine and celebrate the work that video games do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eschrich at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. In this episode, we'll talk about Citizen Sleeper, a 2022 game developed by Jump Over the Age. You can play it on nearly any platform, including Mac and PC computers, Xbox and PlayStation consoles, and the Nintendo Switch. The game was lauded by critics and won the Social Impact Award at the Game Developers' Choice Awards. A sequel was announced in June 2023. Citizen Sleeper is a brilliantly written and art-directed experience that the developer describes as role-playing in the ruins of interplanetary capitalism. You play as a sleeper, a human consciousness implanted into a cyborg body. You've escaped servitude to an interstellar corporation, and you find yourself on a space station on the edge of civilization, a somewhat lawless outpost. The game borrows mechanics from tabletop role-playing and challenges you to survive, build relationships, investigate mysteries, and secure a livable life for yourself. My guests in today's episode are Gareth, Damian Martin, and Phoebe Wagner. Gareth is the designer and writer of Citizen Sleeper and the game In Other Waters. They are also the founding editor of Heterotopias, a zine covering video games and architecture. Phoebe is a writer, academic, and editor of 3 solar punk anthologies, including Sun Vault and Almanac for the Anthropocene. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wake up, sleeper. Dreaming again? Every cycle, you take your chances. You roll your dice. You do the work, get paid, survive. You turn up for your friends, or you don't. That's life on the eye.
Wake up, sleeper. Your body is dying. Planned obsolescence. As an ARP's gift for its escaped workers. But we can fight this. You can remake yourself here. They don't own you anymore.
Wake up, sleeper. You are hunted. Break their locks. Access their secrets. We are waiting.
Okay. Phoebe, Gareth, thank you for being with me today for this CSI Skill Tree conversation. Gareth, I'm hoping you can just kick us off. Could you tell us a little bit more about Citizen Sleeper's vision of the future, as well as the structure of its story, and even maybe talking a bit about the mechanics, the basic mechanics that power that story? I'm also interested to hear what inspired you to kind of like orchestrate everything in this particular way, but we can get to that after you've laid some pieces on the table for us, I think.
Sure. Yeah. So Citizen Sleeper's, it's set in the kind of some distant future, the kind of vague date. And it's set in some vague space of interstellar space where you are a sleeper, which is a person who is in debt to a corporation, has basically signed themselves up to a program where they're put to sleep, they're put into kind of cryogenic sleep, and their mind is copied and emulated into an artificial body, which then works off that debt for the corporation. And Citizen Sleeper kicks off with you escaping from that corporation and turning up on a space station called the Eye, which was once a kind of the jewel in the crown of a corporation that collapsed and is now a kind of for a place that's kind of falling apart. Maybe it's falling kind of into disrepair and towards collapse, or maybe it's transforming into something new. It's kind of hard to tell. It's in that mid state. And in the game, you basically kind of choose how to build a life for yourself on this space station, how to distance yourself from your past working in indentured labor for this corporation, and what kind of future you might be moving towards, whether that future is an escape, from where you're at, whether it's a life where you're living, or whether it's something else entirely. The way the game works is it's broken down into cycles. We say cycles, but think of them as like days. It's just that in space you don't have days. And each cycle / day, you roll a number of dice depending on the condition of your body. And those dice are what you use to perform actions, to assist characters, to make money in the world by picking up kind of bar shifts or random jobs. And the value of the dice directly affects the outcome of that action. So you might roll a 6, a 3, and a 1, and a 6 is going to be the dice you want to use for the thing that you're most interested in getting a good outcome for. And the 1 is the thing that you're going to use for the thing that maybe is safer, or maybe you kind of don't care what happens. So the core of the mechanics work around that. And at the same time, because you've escaped from your corporation, you have this thing called planned obsolescence, where basically your body is decaying intentionally because the corporation doesn't want you to exist outside of its walls. And because of that, you need to get access to a kind of corporate manufactured drug called stabilizer. Otherwise, each day or each cycle, you lose a little bit more of your condition, what we call condition, as your body moves towards collapse. And so the whole game is kind of this process of balancing your daily life, meeting characters and kind of becoming involved in their lives, and also maybe trying to plan for the future in a world that seems entirely resistant to the possibility of there even being a future for someone like you.
Well, thank you for all that. Set a wonderful foundation for this conversation, obviously. I guess one of the things that stuck out is the way you were describing it there is that the dice both connect the game to tabletop role playing, but also stand in for luck, maybe the vicissitudes of life, and maybe even like the way that your energy might wax or wane during a particular day. Like there's just some things you're going to be able to do a better job at in your daily life than others. Is that kind of, did you sort of imagine like kind of managing all of those, I don't know, real world daily realities as being part of the push and pull maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the game is very much inspired by my experiences of working in the gig economy. So picking up random shifts and working for employment agencies where they might phone you one morning and tell you, okay, you've got a bar shift at 9 p.m. tonight, and you turn up at a place and you meet people you've never met before, and they don't even know why you're there. And somehow you do a day's work and then you never see them again. And kind of like living what I kind of observed, I guess, in my experiences and in the experiences of people around me was how exposed to chance you are when you're living kind of at the edge of a functioning system, or a dysfunctional system, really, when kind of capitalism has this one kind of core center of the financial markets that is the place where it kind of quote unquote works, and then this vast periphery of dysfunctional kind of semi-constructed versions of it, where sometimes things work, sometimes things don't, sometimes things are for profit, sometimes someone's nice, and so it's not 100% for profit, it's also for humans. Like existing in that space, and especially in the kind of vast peripheries of it, you're in a space where you're very exposed to chance, you're very exposed to the market, you're very exposed to your resources being devalued, or just having a bad day, and that bad day being kind of terminal for your ability to function economically, physically, or psychologically. And so the dice kind of stand in for that kind of, that feeling of chance that maybe is not something quite so pure as chance. It's something kind of structurally constructed. But for the sake of Citizen Sleeper, the dice are kind of, they're standing in for a lot of things, I guess. They're also standing in for kind of experiences of mental health, for disability, for being in a position where you don't know what resources you might have on any given day. And those resources are something you have to carefully manage or deal out in order to survive. So yeah, they're doing in the end, they're doing a lot of work. And they are coming very much from tabletop games, and that's where I kind of observed that they might be useful for this kind of like large and symbolic and also functional purpose within the game.
Yeah, there's one thing as I was kind of revisiting in preparation for this conversation that I really appreciated and knew, which was that those 1 and 2 dice rolls, they can be useful there's a sort of cyberspace in the game. Gareth, I apologize for not remembering the proper noun, but there is the space station's networks, digital networks, where you can unlock keys, you can hack into people's kind of personal devices and get data that might be useful to people in various ways or valuable to sell. And that's also it can ties into some plots about helping out certain people who are trying to get their freedom or get more resources or get an upper hand against an adversary. And those ones and twos, or frequently those low rolls, are quite useful in you can apply them to these hacks. So I thought that was such a kind and generous piece of game design in a way, because you come to rue those ones and twos, and like you said, sometimes you're feeling the hit for many cycles of one day that just doesn't go the way that you want it to, but you can kind of make it count in some way. It's like you can be a better version of yourself in the digital world that day than you can in the physical space, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think always my design, because it's inflected by tabletop games, I'm kind of interested in keeping people playing and making sure that there's story and things happening where people are. So meaning that I'm not kind of creating like an absolute objective story world where it's like, if you're failing and failing is bad versus succeeding, which is good. It's much more like a failure is just another kind of like step along in a narrative path. So I try to kind of, one of the ideas behind that system, for example, is not just the kind of mechanical nicety of, well, I have a low number, but maybe I can find a use for it, but also that in some ways, if those numbers represent maybe your physical capabilities, that the fact that the low numbers tap into your kind of metaphysical capabilities or your like digital capabilities as a network being also tells a little bit of a story of being a creature which is kind of between worlds, a medium maybe between the digital and the physical. So those low numbers are kind of designed to be like, well, yeah, the body is weak, but maybe the mind is strong in those moments.
Yeah. So Phoebe, I want to turn to you. I know you've been thinking and writing and doing editing projects recently around cyberpunk and other kind of punk movements and genres within speculative fiction. You've been looking at how the genre of cyberpunk shaped our sensibilities about technology and power in the future, and considering how it might be updated, adapted, or still relevant in some ways today. This game, Citizen Sleeper, is often described by critics and fans as a cyberpunk game, and we're about to dig into that. I'm turning the page toward like the cyberpunk chapter. But for you, I guess, like cyberpunk lensed or otherwise, what like sticks out for you about the world that this game builds and that you're inhabiting and navigating here, and how you're forced to kind of grapple with power and physical infrastructures and social institutions in this possible future?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I so enjoyed about this game is how I felt like it was hitting a lot of spots that we don't always see in cyberpunk. And Gareth, you just brought up about how like the physical capabilities and how we so often associate, the higher dice rolls, depending on the system you're using, with that strength or ability, right? But how we have this space for the ones, and that it taps into that metaphysical or like non-human is how I was thinking about it. And I think that was something I was so excited to see, was this non-human that was not AI necessarily, and just working through this world that was also not entirely technologically based. Like two things that came to mind with this question immediately was environment and displacement. And I think so often in cyberpunk worlds, the environment's already like gone, and or it's very limited use, or it's just acid rain. When in Andrew's Dream of Electronic Sheep, I think so much about the moment where I believe it's a toad, right? That Decker sees that comes out and he thinks it's real and then it's not. And how impactful of a story moment that was, because the environment is so like non-existent in that world. But one of my favorite parts in the game was in Citizen Sleeper was when we were in the Greenway and then the Dust House. Those moments were just so interesting to me, and thinking about adaptation and thinking about how people bring greenery or their environment with them, and that desire, and how that still can find a place to thrive in this cyberpunk world, that we don't have to think about it as something that is just gone and we cannot find anymore, right? So that was something I really appreciated. And also just this idea of displacement, I think that gets glossed over when we think about cyberpunk very broadly. I'm not thinking necessarily about a text, is how this kind of, the environmental disasters is going to cause so much displacement. And oftentimes I feel like it gets hand waved too. Like, you pass the people waiting in line for food, or you pass the people that need housing. But here it's just so visceral, where you're helping Lem and Mina and trying to find out if there is a place for all of you to go. And this just felt like it dealt with it in such a visceral way that I really liked. Like, it just seemed to really engage deeply, as opposed to more of an individual, cool hacker, figure going through a cyberpunk world. So I really loved how I felt it hit so many moments that we don't always get to deeply explore in what might be considered a cyberpunk story.
Phoebe, what is the Greenway? This is for folks who are watching who haven't played yet.
I think Gareth should I want to hear Gareth describe it.
Oh, I want to hear you describe it. Okay, I mean, it's a bit of the station that used to be, maybe it used to be like gardens or farming. It's like a greened part of, it's like a big greenhouse part of the old corporate station. And then in the kind of collapse of the corporation and the collapse of the system of the station is kind of like, yeah, it's very much another part of the station that's on its way to becoming something else. So it's kind of like it's growing wild, but it's also like what? It's growing wild in spite of the fact that it's in space, which is a place where plants don't usually grow. And so there's a kind of open question in the Greenway about why is this place thriving and in this particular environment. I mean, I think that like this inflection, this environmental inflection, I think very much comes from the fact that the game was very heavily inspired by Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Singh. And I think that the idea that, the big thing in that book, one of the big ideas in that book is the idea of assemblages. So like the kind of, she theorizes like about understanding within the peripheries of capitalism, understanding like economies, individuals, ecosystems as like associated with each other in something called an assemblage. So rather than looking at each of those things individually, or rather than focusing on the kind of them as separate, disparate elements that have a node graph between them, but instead like saying like, oh, this is one assemblage and it has these elements in it and they're all kind of communicating and affecting each other. And those things can be economic systems, they can be natural systems, they could be culture, they could be individuals. And I think that like that really fascinated me into when I was thinking about kind of capitalism in sci-fi and making a science fiction game about capitalism. For me, that was like a really compelling narrative thing. So I would say the Greenway, in short, is an assemblage. That's kind of like how I thought about it in my head, is like, let's make a Sing assemblage in this game.
Well, and it feels like it's so, the word that always sticks out to me from that book is entanglement too, and how it does feel like it's so entangled in your survival and your adaptation later on in the game, but also in just how so many of the different parts, like the different little stories, you're always going back there to get mushrooms, and then the mushrooms continue to be more important as the game goes on. At least that was my playing experience. And so how, it's just deeply entangled into the plot and the character arcs. So.
Yeah, and it represents a space that, in terms of the interaction design and the how you encounter it, is kind of parallel to the network, the digital or metaphysical network we're talking about. It has some of the same features of that space of feeling like the prompts and things you can do in there, but then also a place where different social organization flourishes than you encounter early in the system, and places where there's more of a sharing economy versus early on there's a monetary economy and like a barter economy where you're sort of trading favors with people, and sometimes there's a real quid pro quo element where you might be working with someone who you don't totally trust or fully agree with, and later, if you, depending on your political leanings and stuff, you might have the opportunity in the Greenway to do something that feels more organic and harmonious, and that helps you along quite a bit by providing for you. And the mushrooms, of course, yes, Phoebe said, become a big part of that. So I want to tackle the cyberpunk question a little bit head on. So, Gareth, Citizen Sleeper has been described this way. I think it's culturally metabolized in many ways as a cyberpunk text, but you've described it to us anyway, a bit more as connecting to noir. Could you tell us a bit about how noir aesthetics, tropes, moods affect the game mechanically and story-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like me cheekily pointing to one of the thought experiments that led to the creation of the game, which was kind of looking at William Gibson and saying like, what if William Gibson was not what if cyberpunk didn't follow after William Gibson? What if we had William Gibson and then no one wrote any cyberpunk again, and that was the end of it. And so that to the point where people would kind of not really think of the genre existing, because when I went back to those books, I had such a strong sense of some suggestions that maybe weren't taken, or some potential kind of configurations of like with any kind of early work in a genre. I mean, there's gonna be a big question, obviously, of like, where does cyberpunk begin anyway? Because obviously, like, we just talked about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is way before then, and yeah, contains all of those things. But again, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is very much a noir story in terms of form, and so is a lot of William Gibson's work, in the sense that they're often about individuals who are thrown into trouble of some kind within an environment that is harsh and in a moment of transition, perhaps between industrial, like non-industrial, industrialized life, between, they're kind of in these like modern transition space, modern transition economies. And so I always think of, like, when I look at Gibson was kind of like, he was trying to do Burroughs, but like kind of maybe more towards the noir side of things, and more trying to bring in those aspects. So I think like there's an interesting question of like, if you think about a Gibson book not as a cyberpunk book, but maybe as a noir book, it kind of like refocuses some of the aspects that you find in that book. And then if you think about it again as like just a science fiction book, as opposed to like sticking this kind of cyberpunk label, more detailed label on it, you also like it becomes reconfigured. And so I think I just was interested in digging at, because I love Neuromancer. I love Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It's one of the first science fiction books I ever read, and it left a really strong impression on me. And I kind of read it not knowing anything really about science fiction. And so I've always felt that book is kind of in a weird nebulous space, because I read it, in a moment of not even having a context for it. And so yeah. I think I was motivated to try and bring some of that back, to look at these works and see like what's interesting here that might help me to talk about now, because I think there's a lot of relevance in those works, but in a way, like the cyberpunk genre gets in the way of that relevance, because it becomes formalized. Like the structures start being about the genre, then they're not about reality. What Gibson was very much writing about his own experiences and his own reality. And obviously Philip K. Dick, something like Scanner Darkly or whatever, he's very much writing about his experiences, what it felt like to be a person to him, and what it felt like, what McCarthyism felt like, what did it, what was happening in the US in the drugs trade, like what, all of these things are kind of like so about their time. And when they become genreified, I think they lose that. So yeah, I think, I accept that Citizen Sleeper is a cyberpunk game, but when I was making it, I wasn't ever thinking about that word or that genre really. I was trying to keep myself like sectioned off from it, and to try and work in a space that felt like it was maybe hopefully recreating some of the ideas that led people like Gibson to write what they did, that they, really trying to write a book about a current moment that's about the interactions of technology and memory, about the ways in which technology might represent a kind of psychic or emotional space more than a technical space in society. And I think, Gibson in his own time was very well positioned to do that, because he didn't really use technology, like digital technology. He didn't have a computer, he wrote on a typewriter. And I think he observed it from this kind of like distant fascination. And I wanted to catch some of that spirit, because I think when we use Facebook every day, or when we use digital platforms every day, the digital networks are just a kind of, they seem to become meaningless. They seem to become kind of just like logistical social structures. But I think actually there's something really deeply correct about the way in which early cyberpunk works saw technology that continues to be true. And I kind of want to get back to that, or like find little elements of that in my work. So I think that's where I sit with that.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to observe is that, and we talked about structure a little bit earlier, story structure, the way this game works, at least for me, was that, you know, you have a lot of options to build relationships with different people, with different characters, and sort of help them on a project that they're engaged in. It might be to try to get off the station. It might be to try to make a particular dish using a mushroom that's hard to get. It might be to help a group of refugees later in the experience. And each of those plot lines, as you pursue it, and a couple of the ones I pursued, including where you help out a rather intelligent vending machine that you encounter, they end up feeling like they perhaps have more of that cyberpunk DNA, or that they partake more in some of these other genres, perhaps. I mean, you have a character who I think you've said like recalls Deckard from Blade Runner a bit, who is kind of a scoundrel, and you know, you can have a very emotionally roller coastery relationship with that person as you go through the game. But you know, each of these feels like they're, you know, taking tropes and ideas from different genres and reworking them, and I mean, to me anyway. So it felt like I, you know, as I played through more than once, each playthrough I felt like I was getting different shadings of different genres and kind of constructing a way through the world that felt like I was inhabiting a different aesthetic and literary space, as much as just a different set of decisions that I got to make.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, that's why I kind of like, I'm quite stuck to the idea of Citizen Sleeper as a science fiction game, in the terms of like how I understand science fiction as someone who read a lot of science fiction as a teenager and kind of loves science fiction, is like it's engaging with like a much broader palette than something that would describe itself as cyberpunk, I think. And a lot of it was me thinking about ideas like, like Ethan as a kind of like cyberpunk protagonist, but also, you know, what's the limited difference between that and a kind of noir protagonist, right? He's also like he's an alcoholic kind of like skip tracer, like that is Deckard. But he's also a kind of reaction to that, or a perspective on that we don't see because we're playing as a sleeper. So we're playing as the pursued target in that, the kind of who usually is kind of confined to a very specific emotional and plot space in those stories that ultimately is slightly impoverished, right? Like in the story of the kind of alcoholic cyberpunk cop hunting down androids, the androids get to be characters, but often the space they're allowed to inhabit is incredibly limited. While the kind of alcoholic cop gets a very broad emotional range, right? So I'm kind of playing games with that. And another character that felt like that for me was Ankita, who's a mercenary, and we see mercenaries in science fiction over and over again. And I really wanted to make a story there that was asking the question, like, what does it mean to be a mercenary? What does it mean to fight somebody else's battles for money? And to try to also play a little game with the player where, you know, provide them a character that they'd be like, oh, cool, a mercenary, a cool looking mercenary. How cool. And then to try and be like, yeah, but how cool really is this situation? Like, what is actually happening under the surface here? So, yeah, I think, you know, maybe it's because I'm kind of taking genre elements and then maybe like thinking about the material conditions, or like the kind of the real world like shift that I can put on those characters. And I think that was a big focus for me, is all of the characters in Citizen Sleeper. They are archetypes, but I never wanted to think about them as kind of like archetypes. Instead, I was thinking very much about each one having a very particular set of material conditions that leads them to be in the place they are. So like you know, the street food chef, having had a previous life as being part of a corporate colony, and you know, using experimental technology and ending up kind of permanently disabled by that process, is like that to me is what's interesting. I'm interested in those conditions that create that effect, rather than necessarily like kind of just providing an archetype and then just like using them as a genre tool.
Phoebe, you know, not only are you engaged in this project on cyberpunk, but you've been really active and formative member in like the kind of solar punk movement, and I feel like probably have quite a lot to say about even just the utility and sort of affordances, I guess, of these like punk labels, or as Gareth said, starting to like slice and dice science fiction into these particular aesthetics with their themes and you know, preoccupations. What do you make of all this? And is there, what are some helpful lenses to look at this game? What does it open up looking at it through these particular lenses, and what does it close off?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, because like that's something I'm asking myself as we see like solar punk start to sort of evolve and change quite a bit right now in this moment. And like so often, sometimes it just feels like it's something of a marketing tool. Like, if you Google new cyberpunk games, like Citizen Sleeper shows up, And so I think that's like, a way that this game has been tagged from sort of that perspective. That I can see, though, even while playing it, I see all the cyberpunk connections, right? Like I see why it shows up on these lists, but there are certain moments that feel like it's doing so much more, like that more broader science fiction sort of connection that you were talking about, Gareth. Like I totally see that. And so I think that's just something, that I've been thinking about in terms of like, what is the utility of using a punk genre? Though I think for Citizen Sleeper, like you were clearly thinking about capitalism, and there I think there is some utility to adding that punk onto the end of it to get this idea of pushing back against authoritarianism, of pushing back against capitalism, and sort of this undermining of a system. And I think that's very clearly happening throughout Citizen Sleeper, and like having you get to choose how you're playing that character is part of that as well. So that's kind of one of the ways that I've been thinking about it, is when really pushing back against these establishments. I think having that punk tag, at least for me, helps me think about my work and how I want readers to think about my work when they approach it, that there is going to be this anti-capitalism associated with it. We are going to be pushing back against certain systems. But at the same time, it then does also limit your audience, where maybe you want this person to come in and be exposed to some of these ideas, or have to make these difficult choices and really have to think about it. So it goes back and forth, but sort of along those lines, though, like one thing that solarpunk has is it's very solarpunk has a pretty clear aesthetic. Cyberpunk does as well, but it felt like Citizen Sleeper does lean into that aesthetic. Like a lot of the character designs reminded me of sort of techwear, and some of like the blockier designs. So I was curious, Gareth, like, do you see like the sort of atmosphere and aesthetic of Citizen Sleeper connecting a little bit, or did that just sort of how did that develop?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, some of those things are like, I feel like someone who really likes cyberpunk, except I don't like cyberpunk. It's really hard. I feel really like I'm stuck between the two cyberpunks, because I love what I would call like urban science fiction, right? Like I love science fiction in an urban setting. I love science fiction that's about everyday people, or about that is very relatable. I like kind of realism, not in the way we usually use it in science fiction, but kind of literary realism in science fiction as well. I like those tones. I like world building. So I like all of these things. And so I think I tend towards like cyberpunk naturally as an idea, but then cyberpunk feels actually like it's so cyberpunk, the thing, can feel so divorced from those, because none of those things are actually a big part of many what we now call cyberpunk works. And so it's kind of like, I feel just kind of like I just want to distance on some level myself from it, while simultaneously like working kind of in that space. I think it's, it's interesting. We just announced the sequel to Citizen Sleeper, and it's kind of funny to play this game now of like, you have one game and you're kind of like, well, this is not cyberpunk, and it kind of gets absorbed into cyberpunk. And then you're like, well, now there's an opportunity to kind of like continue to hollow out this space. So like now, if you say this is cyberpunk now, great, because now I can start to adjust the genre myself. And so, I think in the process of making Citizen Sleeper, I was making a work that was unaware of what its potential genre impact would be, right? You don't know when you're making something what its impact's going to have, but then seeing the work have an impact and seeing it being kind of like labeled as cyberpunk made me be like, okay, well, there's an opportunity here for this work. If we go through the thought experiment of, if this is a cyberpunk work, what does that say about cyberpunk in the year 2022 and 2023? And that suddenly gets me excited, because then I'm like, well, can we hollow out a space here that allows for this work to problematize how cyberpunk is thought of? And I think there's a huge potential, and there's obviously a huge movement in making cyberpunk work now. There's a huge interest, and some of that is driven by the marketability of cyberpunk, but I think a lot of that is also driven by people's feelings of relevance towards cyberpunk, and their kind of like their feelings of how it represents reality. And then it's a whole mix of things. I think it's because, like all science fiction, it's part fantasy and part social, like embedded, cyberpunk is both. It's simultaneously, I think, when you say capitalism, for example, cyberpunk is simultaneously like luxuriating in the worst ideas of capitalism, but enjoying it. It's also like a fantasy of being the ultimate resistance, where like but to be the ultimate resistance, you kind of need the like ultimate like villain. You need capitalism to be the most authoritarian structure possible to have the ultimate resistance. And then somewhere in the middle, I think there's like a space where maybe kind of interesting things can happen, but it's so nebulous. And these two poles are incredibly magnetic in terms of how people think about it. So you're constantly feeling like everything's getting drawn towards like, is this kind of like, let's chop people up with a samurai sword and just kind of be like, the world is worthless, so like we can be as violent as we want and we can destroy the world? Or is it like, we are really like embedded in a resistance culture and horrible corporations and we are the resistance? And it's like, yeah, it's, I feel the tension of those things pulling me. So I'm trying to like fashion a little space between those, but it's fun to think about. I think generally it's a frame that's, it's a frame that's in question right now. And I think that's what's fun. Maybe it's like, maybe cyberpunk kind of 20, 30 years ago was maybe like a bit more ossified. But now I feel like there's a question. There is a question around cyberpunk things. There's work being made. There's a kind of provocation happening. So I'm enjoying Citizen Sleeper being part of that.
Yeah, and I think as like an outsider looking in and someone who's played the game, like that's why like I always feel like I want to call it cyberpunk, is because like this is what I want to see, like this is. Yep. And so like hearing you talk about it and like this idea of opening up space for that, like, yeah, like that's exactly what I hope, because I've never felt a lot of attachment to a lot of cyberpunk. It's more been like, I be for all these reasons. And so Citizen Sleeper was one of the more recent versions where I've been like, yes, like this is what I want to play around with. I think this is the world that I want to like, play a video game about. And so yeah, so I think that's exciting how you're thinking about it.
So one thing, Phoebe, that for me, that solarpunk as a more recent emerging nebulous, productively nebulous movement within speculative fiction, it's been helpful and opened up the idea that, resistance can be about building new things and, being the architect of new systems and like figuring out new formations for communities that are built in many ways. Gareth clarifies things by saying material realities, like taking, if it's cheap solar cells with all the complexities that like the production and waste generated by solar cells come with, but cheap solar cells can actually engender different kinds of community and kinship and livelihoods and things like that. One thing that, struck me about this game, the experience of playing this game, is you get into, again, these genre spaces that feel, and I'm only saying this because I think about solarpunk all the time, so I know all these cool solarpunk creators, but that feels solarpunky because they're about people building new systems and new communities, kind of in the interstices of these either broken systems or just actively exploitative structures that they're living under. So yeah, I wonder, I don't know if solarpunk's like the label, you probably wouldn't attach that label to this game, but it's almost like thinking of these genre categories as a way of a lens through which you can apprehend a game or a novel or a text, and sort of see it from new angles and sort of see some of the verbs that are happening in the game in new ways.
But yeah, and like the thing that was striking me, like, yeah, like certainly wouldn't apply solarpunk necessarily, but there's so many, solarpunk and cyberpunk I've always had in my head as, as connected genres, that there's a conversation to be had here that I think we're just sort of now really starting to happen as cyberpunk is starting to change. But one of those things is like, yeah, the way that community is working, the way that people build community, the way that there are these different economic systems, the way that communities form that aren't entirely human, like all of these aspects could just easily be ported over into a more solarpunk style story. And just like the focus on adaptation in precarity. I mean, that is what's happening with climate change. Like, Gareth, you said it on a space station, but that similar sort of consideration and concern is what motivates a lot of solarpunk stories. So I think there's a lot of excitement, or I see a lot of exciting avenues for how these are very much in conversation with each other potentially, if this is the path that cyberpunk as a larger genre continues to go down. But yeah, I was picking up on a lot of that overlapping as well too, in I think generative ways. Like I was like, oh, this is just cool. So
So while we're talking about building and picking up on solarpunk, I want to jump to the topic of architecture. So Gareth, you also edit and publish Heterotopias, which is a zine about games and architecture, which people should check out. And I was wondering how architecture comes into the design of Erland's Eye, the station in Citizen Sleeper, and how much of the game is, to your mind, about exploring a city or coming to understand infrastructure. And Phoebe, I am interested in what you think in terms of the way that the infrastructural politics of solarpunk help you to think about this game, how we rely on resist and reconfigure sort of the spaces that we inherit or inhabit or get sort of funneled towards and into.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the architecture of the eye, there's an interesting kind of genre element to it as well, I think, because, for example, one of the areas, the eye is a ring station, and it was once a corporate structure that's then kind of like fallen apart, been damaged, had to be kind of like reconstructed. One of the images that I come back to again and again in the game that really struck me and I really enjoyed, and I kind of discovered by accident when writing it, I didn't really plan it, but was this idea that the eye went from being spun from its center as a ring station to being spun from its rim, and what that kind of like reconfiguration of where a center might be in like an actual, there's that fun game of when you make a space station which is essentially just a giant object in space that is also an object, which is also a system. When you start talking about the system and the system falling apart or the system being broken, it has a wonderful kind of like resonance with so many elements of the game. And in this game, the system is both your system as a physical system yourself, the kind of AI network system of the networks, the physical system that spins the eye. It's the system of extractive capitalism that kind of fuels the universe that made the eye, and it's the organizational systems that have kind of like built the eye itself. It's kind of like there's a union that got left over as the only administrative structure after the collapse of the corporation, and so they, as a system, took kind of primacy in the space. But then refugees came, and that affected it. And so, yeah, I think a lot about that. And when I was designing the architecture, I guess I was thinking a lot about that kind of how you manifest that in a kind of physical reality. Like, how do you make something that looks like it's been through these processes, but also isn't just kind of like, I don't know, too ragged, like too kind of disassociated as an architectural structure. And it was a really interesting and tricky process. And then one of the other things that I did, which is quite similar to the attempt to look back at kind of Gibson's work and try to adapt Gibson's work, ignoring the entirety of the cyberpunk genre, was a big inspiration for the eye was the Kowloon Walled City, which is kind of like a famously cyberpunk inspiring place. Like, I think, the vast majority of cyberpunk media features some variation of the Kowloon Walled City or something, or some other part of Hong Kong. It's quite a popular kind of reference point for cyberpunk. And the Kowloon Walled City is interesting because it was isn't a kind of architectural anomaly that, because of British and Chinese rule in Hong Kong, ended up existing in a kind of unregulated space where nobody really wanted to take responsibility for it. And that allowed it to then be built on top of, to the point where it became a kind of a city within a single block, a single physical block. And one of the things I did is, I've always been fascinated by the Kowloon Walled City, but I'm very aware of the kind of Orientalism and the kind of history of the use of the Kowloon Walled City to represent a kind of dark and dangerous thing. It appears in even the video game Shadowrun, and it's kind of constantly spoken about as if it's some portal into hell, like as if it's impossible to live there. It's terrible. And I have there's an incredible book about the Kowloon Walled City made by a French photographer who went there and photographed it and did interviews with people. And I used that as a big source book for thinking about what the eye might be as a space that also exists in this kind of transitionary space between once being ruled by somebody and now not really being ruled by anybody. And that, I think as a kind of sometime anarchist, my tendency, I love to represent contexts where when everything falls apart, people don't just start tearing each other limb from limb, right? So that was also a big focus. And I think that's part of, what also people's images of the Kowloon Walled City as like unregulated, therefore dangerous, unregulated,
Yeah.
therefore like hellish. And so, yeah, part of looking at the eye was like looking at the Kowloon World City and actually what was it like to live there, and what structures were built there, what kind of what kind of associations, what kind of residence associations, how did children go to school, what was the postal system within the city, because none of these things were a given, right? They were all had to be renegotiated. And so I think of the eye as architecturally as a space that then has had to be renegotiated in some way. And I had a lot of fun kind of like then looking at all different bits of the eye and trying to kind of put that into every bar or shop or corner that tried to get a bit of that kind of renegotiation of people. Sometimes people like rebuild capitalism in full because they're like, well, that works the best. And other times people are like, well, let's have a commune. And sometimes those things are not even like incompatible in weird ways.
Right.
And so, that's so the kind of, I think I less thought of it as a kind of, when we're talking about architecture, less as a kind of architectural space where I was thinking about kind of architectural styles or kind of architectural aesthetics, and more about the architectural principles of kind of like a system playing out, kind of maybe focusing more on kind of urbanism and the patterns and typologies of urbanism that lead to kind of like places which reflect their conditions or that exist in spite of them.
Phoebe, I'd love to hear what you made of the spaces of the game, navigating the game as an architectural space. The game is maybe a kind of exploration experience, or however you'd like to take it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I think the exploration experience in sort of that limited space was really fun too. Oftentimes as a video gamer, I really like to play big open world games. That's just like where I gravitate towards. So having this exploratory aspect, but it being limited by the architecture, was really fun for me. I just enjoyed like sort of the back and forth nature that I found myself doing as I went to the different parts and exploring in that sense. So I really love that. And how each space had its own like sense of character, and how when you're first sleeping in your sort of your abandoned warehouse location, and then eventually things kind of get homier depending on where you go, and you can have the option to feed the cat. Like those were things that I really enjoyed as my character developed and as I got to explore the different communities. So how space and community work together, as you were describing already, Gareth, was really fun for me as a player. Like I just very much enjoyed that, and finding all the little things that I could do. And if I was going to spend my limited money or my limited dice resources on those things, and how to find that balance. So yeah, it was very enjoyable for me to think about it, and sort of one of the things I think potentially cyberpunk and sci-fi more broadly can give us when we think about urban spaces is that the city or the urban space being like alive, whether that's through AI or smart technology or something even bigger than that. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about is how I'm so quick to think of a forest or a desert or a meadow as being alive in a different way than I think of a city block being alive, and trying to shift my focus and how I think about life and like what that means. And I think the station felt so very alive, as you're going through, and you can switch into the more cyberspace mode and like hit the different nodes, and just that getting to talk to the different AIs and networks within the city, within the space station, was just like super fun. And so that was like, I think that's a useful tool for how we think about these spaces, and how we're so quick to go to natural spaces as being alive, but not necessarily urban spaces.
So I sort of meant to ask you this earlier, Phoebe, but I kept getting drawn into the sort of the flow and things that interested me about things you two were bringing up. But I just, as someone who didn't, as the person in the conversation, or one of the two people in the conversation who didn't work on the game, who didn't make the game, I kind of wanted to hear about like just how you encountered it and dealt with the fact that this game is Citizen Sleeper is constantly throwing up difficult choices for you to make. As we've talked about, you're making decisions under constraint. You only have a certain amount of dice, depending on your like the condition of your character's body and your energy, the food you can get, the money you have. You can or can't do certain things. You can't help everyone, which is crushing. It means you have to play more than once, really, if you want to see everything. But also just if you play a lot of open world games, sometimes Phoebe, you probably know you can just help everyone. Time will accordion out or in depending on how much you want to engage in. But here you don't have that luxury. So yeah, and then of course there's chance and randomness. Like there's sometimes you want to do something and it's just not going to be possible. There's timers and clocks, cycle clocks, and sometimes you have to do something by a deadline and you can't. And maybe somebody's life is worse or different as a result of that in a way that you would not prefer. So I was just wondering, like, how you dealt with that. It's so different that I know you and I are often moving around in short fiction spaces and stuff, and something this decision intensive felt really fresh to me as a way to play through or experience this kind of narrative. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about your experience of play and maybe a thing or two that happened in your game that were surprising or thought-provoking or challenging.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like that was, I think, it was a very unexpected aspect for me when I was playing, is because I at first I was definitely not paying as close attention to the clock and the different wind downs, and as I won't say should have been, but would have produced different outcomes very early on, because eventually I got to the point where I was like, boy, if I don't really work on Ethan, I'm going to be in very deep trouble. It was like, so I was like, had to focus everything on that while I was playing. And same, I feel like one of the things, Joey, you mentioned about going back and playing again, like definitely when I do another playthrough, because I feel like I don't want to say failed. I feel like you have different outcomes, which is something I thought was really fun. I feel like, yes, this might not have happened, but it feels very real to the situation. Like I did not manage everything well enough for certain characters to be able to like leave the station or something like that. Yeah. And I just was like heartbroken with that. I was like, dang it, what, how did I miss this? And sometimes I think you're right. It comes down, like you mentioned the dice. Like I know there is at least one roll where I really needed to get high numbers, just to try and get some outcomes that I needed for the bounty hunter situation. And I did not. And I was like so frustrated in that moment. I was like, what's going to happen? Yeah. And one of the first upgrades I got actually was the cheat where you can re-roll your dice. That was like immediately, as soon as I saw that was an option, I'm like, I'm getting that one. So yeah, it was definitely like, there's definitely moments, I feel like my game feels very sad compared to, I imagine, other people who are maybe a little bit more familiar with this style of game. I feel like I got a lot of like outcomes where my characters were kind of sad at the end. So I'm looking forward to going back and playing through again, or watching someone else play through it and see what those other outcomes are. Cause it definitely it definitely changes the feel of the game.
Yeah. Yeah. I felt like, actually, it's funny because I continued to play after I'd played a bunch, but we talked earlier and like a while ago, and I got into it again, and I was like kind of thinking about the decisions I'd made, and I was like, oh, I kind of like really invested in a couple of the more cyberpunky plots in a way that I didn't realize I was doing. Like I really got into the vending machine trying to unshackle itself and expand its mind, and I really got into the kind of intra-corporate subversion hacker plot where I was like, planting these like ripper worms in the computer system, and then meanwhile I like wasn't doing daycare for my buddy enough, and I felt really bad about that. And I couldn't it took me quite a long time to kind of move along things with the street vendor who comes up. I think his name is Emphas, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, and I felt like I slow walked that relationship way too much. I poured way too much into the mercenary Han Solo type captain. I think it's Amrita, and then I was sort of like, oh, forget this. I can't believe I spent all my time early in the game, trying to help her out. I'm not sure that's what I want to be living for. And yeah, but I realized that I had gotten like myself into some of the more hacking plots, like kind of by accident. I sort of stumbled into them, and I was like, oh yeah, like now that I'm trying things out differently, I'm trying to actually stay away from the more like digital subversion, computer hackery stuff, and put my time elsewhere to see how it feels and see how my character feels. I think I started my character as like the mechanic too, so there were certain things I was able to do well, and other things like I wasn't very good at physical labor, I don't think. So there were certain things I wasn't able to help with.
Yeah,
because of that.
And I was immediately drawn to, as soon as we got to the mushrooms, I was like, this is it. So Emphas and I had a great relationship. But also the labor work, that was the other one I was really interested in too. So I like the hacking was like, that's where I ended up, and then I missed out on some of the hacking stuff because I was like, I don't have the time to get to over there. So
right. Yeah, there's whole areas just like now that I'm seeing that that I didn't before. There's the spire, there's this tower and like I just didn't like didn't deal with that until very late in my first run. And yeah, it is just interesting in a game like this that who your character is feels really different based on the decisions you make. Like you're figuring out who you are as like you allocate your time, and that feels like that's like to me where the role playing comes in, is actually from reflecting on how people are reacting to you rather than like what your character's saying. You get to choose dialogue, but I feel like how you spend your time is more important than what you say, which is something. I had a professor in film school who was very into the Western, and he was like, in Westerns, like what you do matters, what you say doesn't matter. And that's like what differentiates them from other genres. And I thought like that really kept occurring to me when I was playing this, that I was like, it's not the dialogue's unimportant. And it's a highlight. I was always excited when I got to a big written section because I really enjoyed the writing, but I just was excited about how people reacted to my choices because it was hard to predict sometimes, which was really fresh.
I mean, that was super. Yeah, I mean, that's very much, it's great to hear. I love to hear my design ideas being
It's
told
working
back to me by somebody. It's the best. That's the best thing you can hope when you're making games. But no, that was very much that exact concept of like, you know, for me, that was very much about what's at stake when you are in a difficult position in life, and you're kind of like where you spend your time, where you invest your time, what you turn up to and don't turn up to is actually like how you make a lot of your decisions. And it's how you end up making friends or not having friends, or like being part of communities or not being part of communities. And sometimes it's really frustrating, and it's, you know, you just can't, sometimes you can't turn up. And if you can't turn up, even in this completely kind of disassociated digital world we live in a post-COVID Zoom call, you know, recording, is still turning up is still the thing. And so, yeah, I felt like that was a kind of really important thing for me. But also the dialogue, I thought a lot about it being, I'm not a big fan of the traditional video game, like, you make all your choices in dialogue. I like to think of dialogue as an opportunity for the player to test out ideas for what they might then do after. So a lot of the scenes are written to specifically create this sense that like you might be talking to a character and that character might suggest to you a few different things. And it happens a lot in the DLC where characters like, are you going to leave the station or are you going to stay? And you can kind of answer like yes or no or maybe, but it doesn't matter what you answer from a gameplay perspective. I'm not tracking that. That's not something that's important to me, because I will give you the choice and you'll make that choice at some point. But it's more about trying to encourage the player to be narrating their own journey and saying, I'm someone who wants to go. And even if they then don't go, that's what creates the narrative. If you don't give that opportunity to make a promise or to say you're going to do something, then it takes attention out of the action itself, I find. So I really enjoy giving people the opportunity to kind of like to test out their ideas and to even tell characters like, no, I don't want to help you. And I kind of like the idea of telling a character you don't want to help them and then being forced to help them in the end and things like this. So I kind of like, that's how I break it up in my mind when I'm writing the game.
Well, and I just want to say in the DLCs, when those dialogue options come up to say that you want to leave, I was like, who plays this game and wants to leave? I was like very invested that my character would never leave.
Yeah, I have to admit, but you know, that my tendency would be like, yeah, leaving is but it's kind of, that's also the interesting thing about writing something like this is you do have to be like, but people will have a good reason. And if I'm going to give them the choice, I hate it when games give me a choice and then go like, no, that was you're a bad person for making this choice. So I try generally to make sure that if I'm offering a choice, there's always like a kind of justified reason for it. And I tried to like, again, like allow the narration to maybe like, I tried to think about what state of mind people might be in if they chose to do that. And so then write the narration in a way that would kind of support that or encourage it, or sometimes problematize it, sometimes kind of say like, you know, suggest that there's an issue here. But yeah, I hate the idea of the game being judgmental of people. I think if I think a decision is genuinely a terrible decision, I shouldn't even offer it in the game as a possibility. Right. I want to try and, so all the endings were very interesting like that, because I'd sit there and I'd write an ending and I'd write and I'd be like, oh, this really feels like the right choice. But then I'd have to like rewind my brain and sit down and write the other branch. And so often, even if I wrote the preferred branch first, by the time I'd written the second branch, I was like, no, that's the good one. So I'd almost like convinced myself. That's how I knew it was good to go, is that I'd convinced myself that I should choose the opposite to my instinct. So yeah, that was also an interesting process.
As a writer, when I got to those dialogue options, I was like, oh, so there's a way to play this game where that feels like the right choice. And I was like, that's certainly, like, I'm like so interested in the communities. I was like, that's not the way that I would ever play the game. But it was very cool to see that there was like this whole other side that like I would like, that me as a player would most likely never get to, but was definitely there, right? So yeah, it was very cool to see.
Yeah, those were fun as well, because it's really fun to tell a character that you're not going to go, even if you're planning to go. Like, there's so much nuance to just that question, and the fact that it doesn't, I'm not making you commit to it, I think is really fun. So yeah, I think thinking about dialogue in games in that way can be really productive, rather than thinking about the space where decisions happen. Because it's not like friendships I mean, unless you say terrible things to people, friendships are not built in conversation. They're built in like encountering or time, or like, in my experience, life bonds come from often when people have needs, and then they make those needs known, and then you fulfill or don't fulfill those needs, and so it kind of requires both the vulnerability to ask for something, and also the kind of generosity to offer or to fulfill something. And that's where, to me, relationships in life occur. So it's like the idea that you kind of choose, like, I hate you, I love you, I don't mind, in a dialogue option, and that sets the tone of the relationship, never quite works for me.
So I want to ask one more question about relationships before we have like a sort of parting shot. But one thing we've talked around and about a bit, but haven't focused on, is that many of the collaborations and enmities and alliances and friendships that you're building in this experience are with non-humans. That you encounter a diversity of human characters, but there's also a diversity of non-human characters. And of course, we talked about like the idea that the station itself is a sort of system that you're encountering, and that's made concrete in various ways. So I just wanted to hear, especially with Phoebe, with Solarpunk's attention to the human and non-human kind of nexus point, what you feel like the game has to say, what interventions it's making, or what meaning it made for you around the issues around human and non-human relations. So, what we mean by citizenship or personhood, what we mean by bodily integrity, or how we define intelligence. How did that bring for you? It's not really a question. I'm sort of more interested in your reaction to it, because I'm not quite sure how to ask.
Yeah, so like one of the things that I have been really interested in trying to figure out how to demonstrate in my own work is how, when we're building community to adapt, to survive, to thrive, that it's going to take everyone, right? Like, not just who we define as human as moving, like as the moving factors of creating this community. And I think this game does a good job of showing like that, how it takes everyone. There's certain things that the sleeper brings to the table that allow these communities to thrive, that the human people cannot bring to the table. So I think that just did a really good job of showing that, of this idea of it being all encompassing in a way that it takes the mushrooms, it takes the sleeper, it takes the human characters, all in this sort of entanglement in order to make things work. And that is like how it all comes together. So I thought this game just did a very good job of showing that, and in a way that was very engaging and easy to work your way through and sort of understand.
In terms of for me, in terms of personhood and intelligence and that kind of those sticky concepts, one thing, we've talked a lot about material constraints, material conditions. It works with the game logic too, but everyone who you encounter has a goal. They have something that they want to achieve, whether it's often actually carving out a greater sphere of autonomy, giving themselves some degrees of freedom, perhaps in a situation where they're under quite a lot of constraint. But sometimes it's about preventing a catastrophe or lighting out for a better tomorrow for your family, or something like that. Or again, I've referred to this a few times, just like cooking a dish, creating a piece of art, I guess you could say, that you might not be able to do by yourself. So that idea that everybody has, I think, Gareth, the game uses the vocabulary of drives, that everybody has projects that they're engaged in, and just like privileging in some ways actions over words, in terms of like, causality in the game. I think you don't spend too much time sort of navel gazing about what intelligence means, and instead it's like, okay, what are the actual endeavors in the world that people are engaged in, and how does that sort of like make them who they are, and how does that create niches for them within this like kind of emerging influx community on the station.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's it's funny when you say, you know, that kind of disconcern with intelligence, because I think I've made 2 games now where the first one was where you played an AI, and in the second one you play a like human question mark.
Yeah.
And I think a lot about why it is, because I'm not very interested in AI, I have to admit, as a concept in science fiction generally. I've always, it's time travel and AI are 2 things that don't work for me. And but I find myself drawn again and again to non-human characters. And I think that, you know, I think there's reasons for that. I think part of that is my own experiences of mental health, but also of kind of depersonalization, but also experiences of being non-binary. I think that kind of find me looking for spaces that are outside of formalized spaces that are available to me, or formalized spaces of expression where kind of looking, and I think that the non-human or the kind of human question mark, which is a space I'm super interested in, is a good place for that. It's a good place to talk about what it feels like to be something that may or may not be a human. Even if, you know, we're not really talking scientifically here, we're really just talking in terms of like the word human that we use as a cultural definer, right? And that, you know, obviously the game's called Citizen Sleeper and is interested in citizenship as a kind of term that might be weirdly used as interchangeable with the word like human. And you know, that lots of these terms are kind of used very close to each other as part of a set of information. But I quite like citizen as well, because citizen, maybe you can also, you know, there are plenty of people arguing for the rights of non-humans, and so it's like, well, maybe citizenship is something we could also offer to non-humans, and tie non-humans up in nationalism and all kinds of complex things you have to deal with when you're a citizen. Plants should have to deal with that too. But it's you know, so I'm very, very interested in that space, but not in that kind of question of like, well, if we made a robot that could think like a human, would it be a human? I have so little interest in that, but I have a lot of interest in the affective space, the kind of emotional space of human question mark, and what playing in that space, what allowing a person, because ultimately that's what you're doing in a game, even if my game may not be particularly kind of quote unquote traditional fun, it's kind of like a space for play. It's a space to try things out. And so I think I always enjoy the idea of putting the player into a condition that they might associate with, but they do not have. They're not, no one can be a sleeper. A sleeper is a thing that, and it allows people to then redefine what a sleeper is as to their own personal feelings. So I think I've seen lots of people say different things about, kind of conflicting things about what it feels like to be a sleeper, or what can sleepers smell? Can they hear? Can they taste? Does it, you know, what do they sleep with their eyes open or their eyes closed? And I quite like leaving those little gaps in the text to allow people to play in that space. So yeah, I think it's perceptive to say that, you know, that I'm not interested in the kind of questions of intelligence, more the kind of interactions of non-humans, and also then the ways in which we talk about the categories and divisions and structures we build around them.
Phoebe, anything to add? I see you nodding a lot before we turn to my final shot.
I was just, I totally relate to, I have a lot less interest in the AI sphere and like that kind of question, but exactly what you're saying about what is that effective space. Yeah, I really relate to that. One reason I think my enjoyment out of this is it wasn't a typical like AI narrative in some ways that I might have been expecting, where, okay, are we just defining whether or not AI is human? So yeah, I just had a lot of fun with that too. I like the human question mark. I really related to.
Yeah. I mean, the way the characters work is, I don't think you're encouraged anyway to start saying, well, is this real intelligence or is this just simulated intelligence? You know, so you're sort of actually playing things as they lay a bit more. Somebody presents themselves to you, they are trying to understand you in a certain way. They probably want something for themselves. You can jump on board and try to help them, see if they might be able to help you. It's a bit more practical in a way than like there aren't these philosophical salons in the dialogue where it's like, well, what does it mean to really have a, you know, innate intelligence or an original idea? Can a computer really do that? Like, and that's the usual, that's not atypical in these stories. And some people do it very beautifully and elegantly when writing about AI. But I think it suits your purpose, I think, as I understand it from this conversation, Gareth, to not dwell on that stuff too much.
Yeah, I mean, the vending machine does say at one point, I think I'm thinking, therefore I'm thinking, you know.
That feels a little cheeky.
That's as deep as I get into those questions, really. It's kind of, that's almost there as a kind of like, you know, a little bit of a joke that also kind of puts my position to be like, yeah, sure. Like if it quacks like a duck, like, let's see, let's see what happens.
So this last question, I'm just going to ask you each to do a sort of double-barreled thing, which is I would like to hear you sort of talk about or plug like something you're working on. And Gareth, it might be a place to talk about other things in Citizen Sleeper's universe or not. And Phoebe, some of the stuff you've been working on. But I also would like you to also add to that like a companion piece for this game. So if people watching this decide to play the game or revisit it, you know, should they read something? Should they listen to something? Is there a movie they should watch? Another game they should play? And if you have one or two kind of recommendations or things that inspired it or feel like they go along with the game, that would be great. But also would like to hear you each sort of like share something that people could look for if they want to see more of your work and experience more of your work. Phoebe, you want to start us off?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things I think is that have coming out in July is Fighting for the Future, Cyberpunk and Solarpunk Tales out of Android Press, which is an anthology that includes cyberpunk stories, transitional stories, and solarpunk stories. So really trying to look at this sort of whole sort of continuum of stories. And a lot of them in the cyberpunk stories, I was trying to be really mindful of who was writing the story, like trying to make sure I move away from that Orientalism that we kind of see in older cyberpunk, and really focusing in on community. That was the interest to me in cyberpunk, is these communities pushing back against different systems. And so I think people who enjoyed that aspect of Citizen Sleeper might enjoy some of these stories. There's one called Do Anarchists Dream of, oh no, I'm gonna forget the title, hold on, because it's a good one. I don't want to mess up the pun. Where is it? There we go. Do Anarchists Dream of Collective Sheep by Izzy Wasserstein, which is a very fun one that I highly recommend out of that collection, particularly sort of in this vein. But yeah, so that'll be out in July. Though if people are also interested in the human question mark, that was something I was very interested in as well for a novella I wrote that came out in April called When We Hold Each Other Up. It's not cyberpunk at all. It's very climate fiction, solar punk, but I really wanted to push that and think about those ideas. And so I took a stab at it in that. So if any of that resonated with people, that might be something worth checking out. But something that you said, music, I hadn't really thought of that in terms of if people are sort of thinking about cyberpunk and going back to this, but Clipping has an album called Splendor and Misery, and the band Clipping has Daveed Diggs in it, and who, of course, most people probably know from Hamilton, but has also just been doing a lot of acting. And the Splendor and Misery is a concept album, more science fiction, I would say, than necessarily cyberpunk, but it's about an incarcerated person on a prison ship, and they end up falling in love. And it's just very interesting how it all plays out. So that might be an album to check out that I think deals with some of these themes. So, but I'll pass it over to Gareth.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do it in reverse order, because otherwise I'm gonna get lost and confused, which is that I'll start with the influences and then I'll go to the thing that I'm doing. But yeah, I think the companion piece, obviously, like Mushroom at the End of the World, is the kind of like recommended reading, top of the reading list for like, also I think also like a fun thing to read alongside Citizen Sleeper, because I think it's kind of like, it's a fun game of like where I've been influenced by theoretical structures, they've been actualized in the game, which always is a kind of slightly weird process to then like read about those. It might like provoke a kind of interesting like re-extraction of the theoretical structures in different ways. Especially the phrase ruins of capitalism, I think about all the time, and I love that, because Singh kind of defines it as being not the idea that we sometimes think of ruins, which is like a destroyed place, but instead a place where there is like a variable level of construction of these rules. So like the ruins of capitalism might be a place where like here's a church fully preserved, and then next to it is a wasteland. And I really like this kind of formulation of capitalism as dysfunctional and varied and manifesting in different ways in a space. So I think about that all the time. The other kind of companion pieces, I think the game Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor is a lovely game that kind of sold me on the idea that you can do science fiction and do stories about yourself. I kind of played it many years ago, and it's a game where you play as a janitor in a kind of Star Wars type vibrant spaceport, and everyone's kind of coming in and going on quests and buying expensive weapons at the weapon shops and things like this, and you're just a janitor and you can't afford to buy any of those things, and you just get money based on the trash you pick up. And there's days of the week, and there are like festival days, and then there are days after the festival where there's lots of trash, and it's kind of beautiful. You have to you can change your gender multiple times per week in order to like keep yourself from getting sick, and there's all kinds of like weird stuff going on, but it's kind of wonderful because it's both kind of celebratory of the atmosphere of a kind of Star Wars spaceport that's filled with kind of like life and color and people, and the experience that I've had in cities where you work a kind of menial job. And it doesn't mean that you're just kind of miserable. You can also, it also sometimes gives you the opportunity to observe the way a city works and all the layers of it and all the people from a particular position. And the game really nails that. So it's kind of does like sci-fi as an escapist space, and also sci-fi as a space that is like very relevant to a very personal experience. So that game is super cool, very, very interesting, very, very indie. And yeah, I don't know if there's so many science fiction books that I've just stolen little bits of. You know, that's just the nature of Citizen Sleeper. There's loads of bits of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in there. There's, you know, I think like just because you've seen Blade Runner doesn't mean that you shouldn't read that book, because actually all the best stuff in that book didn't make it into the film, like Mercerism and mood organs and all kinds of stuff. There's actually one thing which I think is Gibson's first ever cyberpunk and science fiction story. Actually, the first story he ever got published is one called Fragments of a Hologram Rose. And it's about about somebody who's recalling a breakup in a kind of ruined apartment in an America that is fallen apart due to a civil war. And they're cycling through a kind of VR sensory experience where they're mixing together the tape of a yogi on a beach doing a routine, which is what that helps them get to sleep by going into that body through this VR experience, with tapes of recordings of the holiday that they took with their ex-partner. And it's this incredible marrying of like memory and computers and technology. And I think it actually is like the closest, despite written like decades before this could ever happen, it's the closest short story I've ever read that feels like kind of scrolling through somebody's Facebook after you've broken up with them. It has that kind of like horrible combination of kind of tech kind of astringency and kind of personal weight and effective space. And it's a wonderful story. It's very short, and somehow like Gibson just kind of wrote it before people had this, before this was a regular part of life. Somehow Gibson conjured it up in this kind of way, which I think is really beautiful and points to the fact that maybe the things we think about technology are not new. They've been around for a long time, and they're more about us than they are about the technology we use. So yeah, those are my things, my companion pieces. And then yeah, we did just announce Citizen Sleeper 2, which is a kind of a bit of a departure. We're kind of like, it's a long way out. We did a little narrative trailer which you can go and watch. You can, and there's some other Citizen Sleeper projects I'm working on as well, but Citizen Sleeper 2 is going to be a kind of story where you're on a ship and you're traveling, and you'll kind of maybe take as someone who has a ship, you'd have to take a little more responsibility. Let's say you might be a refuge for other people, and that's kind of the interesting step. I imagine that Phoebe, you will enjoy it because it's very much about community, but it's in Citizen Sleeper where you are kind of like maybe always trying to get into a community. In Citizen Sleeper 2, you're already like maybe even just part of a potential community leader, but you might not even want that position, but it's too late now. You own a spaceship and people need a spaceship. Just like when, you have a flat and you have a sofa, and sometimes that means someone needs to sleep on your sofa. So yeah, that will be a super fun game. I'm looking forward to releasing that. And we're also doing a tabletop, solo tabletop tarot-based adaptation of Citizen Sleeper, which we don't have time for me to talk about, but basically it involves tarot cards and it's tabletop and you play it on your own. And I think it'll be super interesting. And yeah, you can find out information about those on citizensleeper.com, which exists now. I managed to somehow get hold of that domain despite the fact that I did not buy it when the game came out. So I was I was lucky the scalpers didn't get there first. But yeah, so there's loads of info on there about all these different projects as Citizen Sleeper kind of continues to be what I would describe as an ongoing experiment in these kind of forms and trying to see different ways that it might exist. So I hope it's going to be interesting.
Thanks for that. And relevant for our audience, also there is a short fiction series, right, that you're going to be publishing as well? Yeah.
Yes, there is. Yeah, called Hellion Dispatches, which is it's like a transcription. So that it's short fiction, but it's entirely in the form of transcripts of a pirate radio station that are broadcasting from within the Citizen Sleeper universe. And it's about the kind of reports that they're pulling in of kind of corporations starting to extend their reach into the Hellion system. And it's a kind of combination serial narrative. Yeah, it's again another experiment. So we'll see how it goes, but it's available on my Substack, which is substack.jumpovertheage.com or jumpovertheage.substack.com. I never remember which way around, but I'm sure people will find it.
Try it in every possible configuration, and one of them will get you there. Well, thank you both for your generosity with your time, for your insights, for those excellent recommendations at the end. I really appreciate that as well. And looking forward to reading more from Phoebe and from Gareth and to Citizen Sleeper 2 as well. And yeah, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you, Joey.
All right.